chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Listen to this story of the passing of the mantle from Elijah to Elisha. Now, the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they went to Bethel. The company of the prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you? And he said, yes, I know. Keep silent. Elijah said to him, Elisha, stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho. But he said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they came to Jericho. The company of the prophets who were at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him, do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you? And Elisha, answered, yes, I know. Be silent. Then Elijah said to him, stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan. But he said, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So the two of them went on. 50 men of the company of the prophets also went, and stood at some distance from them, as they both were standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water. The water was parted to the one side and to the other, until the two of them crossed on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, tell me what I may do for you before I am taken from you. Elisha said, please let me inherit a double share of your spirit. He responded, you have asked a hard thing. Yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it will be granted you. And if not, it will not. As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah ascended in a whirlwind to heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them in two pieces. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the world. Amen. Thanks be to God. So earlier this year, I learned that there are grants available to pastors who go on sabbatical. It's true. It's a thing. I did not know that. If pastors are going to take a sabbatical, they can apply for grants in order to pay for their sabbatical. I wish I would have known that 3 years ago. I'll just have to hold that in my back pocket for 4 years from now. But a pastor friend of mine told me that he applied for one of these grants when he took a sabbatical not that long ago, and he put in a request with the Lilly Endowment to cover his sabbatical expenses. He requested $50,000 for a 3-month sabbatical. And unfortunately, he was rejected for those funds. He was curious why he was rejected, so he called up the foundation and said, "Hey, I just want to know why I wasn't selected for this grant." And do you guys know why he was rejected for that fund? He was rejected from that fund because maybe the opposite of what you're thinking. He said, why didn't I receive, he wasn't hard, he wasn't being critical, he was just curious why he didn't receive the funds. And they said, well, you were rejected because you didn't ask for enough. That's right. They turned him down because his ask wasn't big enough. The Lilly Endowment is the United States' largest religious grant foundation. They told him that they have so much money to distribute that they needed to give it to bigger requests. Can you imagine? You request $50,000 for 3 months for a sabbatical, and you got rejected because you didn't ask for enough. I don't know about you, but I think $50K is more than sufficient for 3 months. When was the last time you asked for something really big? I mean, really big. Maybe when you were a kid asking for a toy. Maybe when you were a teenager asking for a car. When was the last time you asked for something real big? 9 years ago, it was 9 years ago at this time, I stood in front of the church and I asked the church if we could raise $20,000 to pay down a portion of our mortgage, just to put $20,000 on the principal of our mortgage. And that seemed like it was a lot. Because it was a lot. Our gross income that year was $96,000. Not net, gross. Total we raised in the completely total that year. And with the board's permission, I should add, I stood in front of the congregation and I asked that we could raise 20% of our annual budget to put down on the principal of the mortgage. It's interesting that this year our attendance and our budget are about 50% more than where we were 9 years ago. Our attendance is about 50% higher than we were 9 years ago. Our budget is about 50% higher than it was 9 years ago. And we did another reverse offering, if you remember, in 2023, 9 years later. And do you know what the ask was? $20,000. Said 9 years later, with a 50% greater budget and 50% more people in attendance, well, maybe we should shoot for the same goal. We did it with less people and less budget. We should be able to do $20K again this year, right? It's really fascinating. Despite our 50% growth in personnel and in finances, we've kind of been hovering around $14,000 for our reverse offering this year. And I don't put blame on anyone at all, maybe myself for the lack of communication, but I mean, we're close to our goal, and we have 3.5 months to hit it, March, April, May, and half of February. But I got to wonder, what if we're not closer to our goal, not because we can't achieve it or reach it, maybe because maybe we didn't ask enough. I don't know. If we got 50% more people and a 50% larger budget, maybe the ask should have been $30,000. That would have been compatible, that would have been in tandem. When was the last time you asked for something outrageous? I mean, really outrageous. Maybe we adults don't do all that much asking. Maybe we don't do all the asking because as adults and parents and grandparents, we're the ones who don't ask for things. We're the ones who are asked for things. If I could ask one more time, what prevents us from asking for big things? What prevents us from asking God for big things? Asking the Lord for big things. Do we ask God for big things? Do we still ask God for big things? Now, James in the New Testament says that you do not have because you do not ask. But he qualifies this a little bit, and it's important. He says, you do not have because you do not ask. You ask, and you do not receive it because you ask for your own pleasures. He's saying, hey, you ask and you don't have because you're asking to satisfy your own self. When was the last time you asked God for something big? Like really big, not for your own gain big, but for the sake of the kingdom big. Are we praying big prayers? Now today we celebrate the Transfiguration. Today is a holiday in the church, a holy day. Today we celebrate that day when Christ was standing on top of that mountain with his disciples Peter, James, and John. It's always the last Sunday before Lent, a season of intentional prayer and meditation. That Sunday is the Sunday where Christ's face shone as bright as the sun, and the prophets Moses and Elijah joined him. And it's appropriate, it's fitting on the Transfiguration Sunday that we would read about either the prophet Moses or the prophet Elijah. And today we read about Elijah because Elijah and Moses are the two prophets, the two Hebrew prophets who were said to have not died. These were the two prophets who were said to have gone directly into the presence of God. They were the two prophets who had incredible encounters with Yahweh. In fact, these were the two prophets who had said they had seen Yahweh. Moses on Mount Sinai when he received the 10 Commandments and he said, Lord, let me see you. And God said, no, you'll die. How about I pass by you and you can see my backside? Elijah had an encounter with God on Mount Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai, the same mountain. He was in the cleft of the rock, if you remember, after he fled for his life. He ran to Mount Horeb and found himself in the cleft of a rock, and the Lord said he would pass by him, and there was an earthquake, and God wasn't in an earthquake, and there was fire and wind, and God wasn't in the fire and wind. Instead, the Lord passed by him in the cleft of the rock in the sound of silence. These two, Moses and Elijah, join Christ on this mountain. So it makes sense that our Old Testament reading today is the story of Elijah. But it is an interesting reading because we didn't read about Elijah's encounter with God on Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, did we? We didn't read that text. That wasn't the assigned reading for today. No, today we read about the end of Elijah's earthly presence and the passing of his mantle to his disciple Elisha. I mean, why did they have to have the same name? I hope you understand me today when I'm talking about Elijah and Elisha. But this story is the story of Elijah's departure. As obscure as it might seem at first, this is an incredibly important story for the covenant people of God. And in order for us to grasp the gravity of this story, we need to rewind the clock a little bit. We need to understand the story of Israel for the last few generations up to this point. You guys know how in movies, like, the story will play out and go forward, and then all of a sudden it'll stop, and it'll like, and rewind, and then they'll retell the story again a little bit differently? That's kind of what's going on here with Elijah and Elisha. We're going to rewind a little bit today. You see, Elijah and Elisha are stationed at Gilgal. I like that word Gilgal. It's just fun to say. Say it, Gilgal. I mean, it's a fun word to say. They're stationed at Gilgal, and that's significant. Gilgal was a place of deep significance for the Hebrew people. Now, Gilgal's not one of those Sunday school stories. You don't hear much about Gilgal in children's church. It's kind of graphic. At Gilgal, after crossing the Jordan, Moses' disciple and immediate follower Joshua, he had the people of Israel renew their covenant after spending all those years in the desert. After new kids and grandkids have been born, they cross the Jordan River, they enter into Canaan's land, and Joshua says, all right, we crossed the Jordan. We need to renew the covenant at Gilgal. We need to mark that God has been faithful. What is the sign of the covenant for the Hebrew people? All the men get circumcised at Gilgal. They put up a monument to God's faithfulness to them out at Gilgal. There is a mark of the covenant, and they hold the Passover at Gilgal for the first time in a long time. Elijah and Elisha are at the place of God's covenant significance. This is a significant place, and they leave it. They leave Gilgal. They start there, and they head out towards Bethel. Bethel was also an important place in Hebrew history, and it's similarly not a Sunday school story. Bethel, it's a place where Joshua led the Israelites in battle against the armies of Ai. I don't know how you say it in Hebrew. I'm not a Hebrew scholar. It's the words Ai. God delivered the Israelites from the army and inhabitants of Ai. If you read Joshua 8, it is really gruesome. This is a gruesome story in the Old Testament. But it was an important place because it was for the Hebrews a sign that God was taking them to the promised land. They had crossed the Jordan River, and they had defeated the armies of Ai. They had deceived the inhabitants of the city, drew the army out of the city, and then took the whole city captive. And Joshua, after the battle at Bethel, set up an altar to God. It was the last stand before Canaan was their land. After God's promise was fulfilled, Bethel was that last place before they could say, this land is ours now. It was an altar. So starting from Gilgal, now they go to Bethel, and then from Bethel, Elijah tells Elisha that he's going to Jericho. Elijah says, hey, stay here, brother. I got to go to Jericho. And Elisha says, as long as the Lord lives and as long as you live, brother, I'm going with you. So they go to Jericho, and what happens at Jericho? This is the Sunday school story. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. And Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. And what happened to the walls? And the walls came tumbling down. Right? We know that story. We like it's still pretty gruesome, but it's a Sunday school story nonetheless. What was important about Jericho? What about Jericho was so important that Elijah was going back there before he departed? You know, Jericho was that massive stronghold, the massive city, the fortified place that stood between the Hebrew people and God's promised land for them. You see, after Jericho and Bethel, after 2 generations, they were finally entering into God's promise. And Jericho is this massive city that needs to be overcome before they can get there. So Elijah goes back to Jericho, this threshold of God's faithfulness. So going from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho, Elijah says he's got to go to one more place. There's one more stop on his trip before he departs. And he says he's going to the Jordan. The Jordan River. What happens at the Jordan River? Like Moses before him, Joshua led the people through the Jordan River on the dry ground. The prophets took the Ark of the Covenant and they stood in the middle of the river as the entire nation, the entire people crossed this small river, but nonetheless a river that was the threshold for them into the promised land. The Jordan River was a marker that they were entering out of the wilderness. They were going into the place God had for them. So Elijah and Elisha have been going backwards. They've been retracing these significant moments of Israel's history. Elijah strikes the Jordan with his mantle, and he and Elisha moonwalk backwards across the river. They end up back in the wilderness, outside of the place of God's covenant with them. They're going backwards through Israel's history. Why? Why on earth would Elijah, before he departs, be going backwards through time? You see, what Elijah's doing here is it's almost as if he's undoing all of these moments where they could remember God's faithfulness. Because Israel has forsaken their first love. Israel has neglected the covenant. Israel has forgotten Yahweh. So Elijah is basically saying with his feet, well, y'all have forgotten God's faithfulness anyway. You've forgotten how faithful God has been to you since the wilderness across the Jordan, through Jericho, through Bethel, at Gilgal. You've forgotten it anyway, so let's just go back in time. We're going to undo this all then. Fine. You forgot God? I'm the prophet of God. Let's go back. Let's go back. Israel has forgotten God. They have forsaken their covenant. So Elijah, before he departs, he walks back all of those covenantal moments. You don't want to live faithfully for the one who brought you across the Jordan, who gave you Jericho, and who sacked Ai at Bethel? Fine. Fine. If that's the way you all want to live your lives, then we can just erase all that history. It's kind of passive-aggressive, no? And if you read this story, it can feel like a really, really hopeless moment for Israel. The prophet of God, before he leaves, is walking back the covenant. And it would be a really hopeless moment, save for the incredible faithfulness of Elisha, his disciple. Because across the Jordan, back in the wilderness, Elisha asks Elijah this unbelievable question. Do you remember what Elisha said to Elijah? Elijah says, hey, brother, what do you want? I'm about to go. You have any last requests? And Elisha says, yes, I do. Give me a double portion of your spirit. And how does Elijah respond? Ooh, that's a hard thing. I don't know if I can do that. In fact, he doesn't say that he can or can't do it. He says, if you see me, it will be granted. If not, it won't. He's saying, this isn't in my control to give you. Now, he's asking to be considered Elijah's firstborn son. A double inheritance was the inheritance given to the firstborn son in the family. So Elisha is saying, I want you to consider me your firstborn son. But even more than that, he is saying, hey, Elijah, whatever it is that made you you, whatever made you the prophet of God, give me double that. I mean, Elijah saw God. Like, he saw the presence of God walk in front of him. And Elisha says, I want twice that. He's asking that whatever made Elijah, whatever made the prophet of God, that he would be double that. You know who Elijah was? He saw the heavens open and fire rain down and drench an altar that had been consumed with water against the prophets of Baal. I mean, you're not supposed to ask this question, Elisha. He's not just saying, hey, can I have your mantle? Can I take up after you when you're gone? He's not saying, I will take this responsibility on myself. He's not just saying, I'll take up the ministry when you're gone. He's saying, no, I want more than that. I want a double portion. I want 2 helpings. You know, I think maybe here at Hastings Church of the Nazarene, we've had some Elijahs in our time. We've had some folks who have been really fruitful and really faithful and really valuable years of ministry and who continue to do so. I also think that based on conversations I've had with folks, some of them are ready to pass that mantle on to someone else. I think there are some folks who are saying, you know what, I would love to be able to pass on the ministry that I've been a part of for a long time to someone else. But they're just not quite sure who their Elisha is. Now, I'm grateful for the ministry and work of so many who have been faithful to God here, and I'm looking forward to the ministry and work of others who God is raising up within us. But I wonder who needs to take hold of the mantle that someone else is holding out to them. Are there any Elishas here today who are willing to take up that mantle, to let God do more within you than you could have ever imagined? You see, what's fascinating is that according to Jewish history, Elijah performed 8 miracles. 8 miracles. You know how many miracles Hebrew history says Elisha performed? 16. According to Hebrew tradition, Elisha performed 16 miracles. A double portion. Elisha saw Elijah depart and be lifted up to the heavens. His request was granted. He was granted a double portion. So while Elijah's departure and walking back of the covenant could have been a really scary moment for the people of Israel, all was not lost. All was not lost. It was like God was rewinding time with Elijah, crossing over those covenant moments in order to say, okay, well, that didn't go as planned. Let's try this again. Let's try this again, and now we have Elisha. Let's run it back. It isn't a hopeless moment because while Elijah does walk back the covenant to the other side of the Jordan, going back into the wilderness because of Israel's unfaithfulness, Elisha is a new start. Not with the same portion of God's Spirit, mind you. A double portion. It's as if God was saying, yeah, you screwed up. Things didn't pan out because you forgot the covenant. Because you were unfaithful to me. Let's walk things back a little bit. Only this time, I will be with you even more. Only this time, I will give you more of myself than I gave you last time. Church, you ever feel like things in your life have not played out the way that you expected? You feel like you've worked and you've worked and you've planned and you've put things together and in order to get to a specific place and only to feel like things are falling apart and you're back at square one. That can be really disheartening. I've had those moments, whether it's your family system, your church involvement, or even within your own spiritual formation. We have these seasons, do we not, where it feels like we've just kind of gone back in time a little bit? Oh man, we're here again. We're back in the wilderness. Felt like God was really taking me somewhere there. I'm back in the wilderness. What do I do here? Like we've totally undone all of the good things that God has done in our life. Am I the only one that's experienced this? Well, sometimes. Sometimes that starting over, I believe, can actually be a blessing from God. Sometimes that bringing things back to the beginning and saying, hey, hold on a second, let's run this back, can be a blessing from the Lord. Now, mind you, when I say blessing, I don't mean easy or happy. What does Elisha do when Elijah's taken up? The Hebrew doesn't really make sense in the Old Testament. It's just kind of babbling. Fire, chariots, horses. And he rips his clothes in grief. He's not happy about all this. But it can also be a blessing. And I hope that we can see in the story of Elijah and Elisha that even if when we find ourselves unfaithful to God, when we walk back His goodness, I hope that we can see that even in those moments, He's not going to leave us. He's not going to abandon us. You know what the solution for God to an unfaithful people is? He doesn't go there and say, well, y'all are forsaken. And you know what? I'm done with you. You know what His solution is with Elisha? Okay, things didn't go the way we planned. Let me give you more of myself. His solution isn't to forsake us. His solution is to give us His very presence. God walks back the covenant not to abandon them, but to say to them, I will truly never leave you. I will truly never forsake you. I will not only restart all this, I will give you more of myself than you could imagine. Y'all thought you had a lot of my presence under Joshua going up to Elisha? No. We're going to run this back and we're going to start out over with a double portion. And honestly, that's what we see on the Mount of Transfiguration, which Tony read earlier this morning. Peter asks to build a dwelling place on that mountain for Jesus, for Moses, and for Elijah. Peter wants to hang out with them on that mountaintop. He wants to hang out with those prophets in a little hut on the mountain. Who wouldn't? But Jesus says, no, we don't hang out on this mountain. In the Mark reading, he actually ignores him completely. He doesn't even address the request. Peter's request to build a tent was too small. That request was too small. The question he was asking Jesus was, hey, can I hang out with you up here for a little bit? And Jesus says, you're thinking too small, buddy. Because Jesus didn't want to hang out with him on top of a mountain. He wanted to go before him every moment of his entire life. He wanted to give him his very spirit to be with him for all eternity. Peter wanted a dwelling place. Jesus wanted to give him himself. That's too small of an ask, brother. The point is not to hang out with me on this mountain. The point is that I will go with you everywhere. We ask God for a slice of bread, and it's like God says, what are you talking about? I'm preparing a table before you in the presence of your enemies. You want a slice of bread? I got a 4-course meal for you. What are you doing? Elisha asked for a second helping. Can I have some more? Can I have a little bit more? Elisha asked boldly for God to remember his people. Elisha's request was not for his own sake, but was for the people of God. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive it because you ask for your own pleasures. Church, we're going into the season of Lent, a season of repentance, reflection, and prayer. As we go into the season of Lent, what are you asking of the Lord? How are you praying that God would do a new thing through you? Not for your personal gain, for the sake of His kingdom. Because here's the thing. God is in the business of doing great things. Like really big things. Like turning your life around big things. Like making you into a new creation big things. We ask God to help us out of this one situation. Oh, I'm facing this hard situation. God, can you help me with this little circumstance? And that's all well and good. And God is saying to us, I don't want to just change your circumstance. I want to make you a new person. I want to make your life whole, birthed by the Spirit. You do not have because you do not ask. Now, we ask God to grow our church, which is well and good, but it's like God is saying, I don't want to just get you a big congregation, okay? I want my kingdom to come into this world as it is in heaven. It's not about growing a big church as much as it is a small church taking a big God into our world. You do not have because you do not ask. What are you asking the Lord right now? Are you scared to ask the question? Because if you're not scared of the ask, it might not be big enough. If the response to the request is, ooh, that's a hard thing, maybe you're not asking enough because God is in the business of big things. We serve a big God who does big things, transformational things, new creation things. You do not have because you do not ask. What are we asking the Lord right now? Do we have the courage to make big requests of the Lord? Because if our scriptures are true, God has more for us than we could have ever imagined. More for us than we could have ever prepared for. If only we have the courage to ask. And this is the good news of Jesus Christ for us today. I hope we don't take lightly what we do here at the table. I hope we can recognize